Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are, and a very warm welcome. We're going to give people a few minutes to trickle in. While we are waiting, if you fancy introducing yourselves in the chat and just saying where you're from and what you're up to, that would be great. But we'll just wait a few minutes for people to come in before we kick off the discussion. If you're just joining us, welcome. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'll just give people a couple more minutes to trickle in, and then we'll get going. Right, I think we will make a start. The session's being recorded for anyone who is a little bit late to the party, but a very warm welcome to this panel discussion about the bottom line on sustainability, cost center or competitive edge. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Thomas Bourne. I'm the founder and chief ecosystem officer of Greenheart. We are a strategic partner to all the most progressive leaders building future fit businesses out there. A couple of bits of housekeeping before I introduce my wonderful guests. First off, the session is being recorded and we will share it afterwards via email and on social media to those, email to those who've registered and more broadly on social media. We will have some time for questions towards the end of the session. Please submit them via the Q&A function, not the chat box. But please do feel free to use the chat box for general discussion as we go through. We'd love to see loads of engagement in there. It should be a really stimulating discussion. I am delighted to be joined by a panel of leading lights at the intersection of business and sustainability today. First up, Amy Clarke, who is co-founder and chief impact officer at Tribe Impact Capital. She's also a trustee of B-Lab UK and a global board trustee of Client Earth. And I suspect she'll be interchanging those hats as we go through the discussion. Chris Norman, MBE, is CEO and co-founder of The Good Agency, a real trailblazer in purpose-led strategy and storytelling for over 30 years now. Joanna Allen, I'm delighted to be joined by the CEO of my favorite and my children's favorite challenger ice cream brand, Little Moons. Joanna has over 20 years experience of scaling startups and managing global portfolios for some very well-known household brands. And last, but by no means least, Jamie Butterworth, who is founding partner at Circularity Capital, a real pioneer in circular economy innovation, and formerly the founding CEO of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Welcome all. Thank you very much for joining us. So to set the scene, there is no doubt, or there's certainly no doubt in my mind that sustainability is having a really tough time at the moment. There's still loads of good news out there, but there is a real tension with the populist agenda taking hold, not just in the US, but all around the globe, and the effect on all of our businesses, frankly, of global conflict, disruption, continued escalating uncertainty, and so on. So we find ourselves in a place where many companies feel that they've had to draw back from their sustainability commitments, some of them just focusing on keeping the lights on, some of them battling the sort of counter narrative, but the reality is the challenges are ever more unpredictable. So what I really want us to dig into today is whether we're looking at sustainability in the right way. Is it, as we've been hearing increasingly, a nice to have cost that businesses frankly can't afford to bear at these challenging times? Or actually, is it a strategic value driver in its own right that we would be short-sighted to reprioritize or deprioritize? So we're not here to debate the science or the necessity of acting on the biodiversity and climate crises. I think we can take those as read, but we are here to talk about the business framing, the risks and opportunities of embracing or not embracing, of deprioritizing sustainability within business models. So that's the key question. I'd like to turn now to my panel to ask you each in turn to give a very brief overview on your take on this key question. Sustainability, is it just a cost center or a competitive edge? Chris, what do you think?
Right. So I'm going to come from a brand and communications perspective very specifically, and brand and communication to create value through sustainability. The key aspect of sustainability at the moment for us, and has been for the last 20, 30 years, and saying everyone says it's a commercial imperative, has to be done because that's the direction of travel. But you get pushback from a lot of the departments of CFO, COO, where's the value created? So I don't think it's just value creation. I think it's value defense or protecting value. And to achieve, and so we believe that every business will have to become sustainable in some form or regenerative in some form for the future, just to survive. And that sounds quite dramatic, but actually the pace of change is happening so quickly that they are going to have to embrace this in some way, shape or form. And there are three kind of key levers to that. One is scarcity of supply. That's raw materials, that's labor, movement of labor, that's water, that's all sorts of things like that. Legislation, regulation, compliance of that sort of thing. And then you've got civil society. And there's a huge shift in opinion over the last 10 years or 5 years in terms of prioritizing sustainability. So there are the audience's values are aligning with those. So even at a kind of basic level of engaging employees or customers or investors, it requires communication. It requires a coherent, compelling narrative to get people on board. So fundamentally, you will not. We believe that you cannot get a sustainability strategy in place unless you get an aligned organization, and that requires communication. So our position is it's a commercial imperative. Those are the three levers, and you need to tell a compelling story to get all your stakeholders involved if you want to achieve your outcome. So it's defense and it's creation of value.
Thank you, Chris. Jamie, I suspect some of that will resonate with you. What's your view?
Thank you, Thomas. And yeah, I think it is a really relevant discussion to have at the moment, given where we are in the world. And I think for businesses, there are a number of reasons why this is relevant. One of them is really focused around the kind of license to operate point around businesses. I think the second one specifically is relevant to businesses in terms of their brand values and their purpose and their product. And that often is most relevant, I would say, or most valuable for B2C type companies. But I think there's also a third component, which is around, and our particular focus, as you know, is around circular economy, is around using circular business models to actually drive a long-term sustainable competitive advantage from kind of a unit economics basis, just in terms of the business models that you're deploying. And I think all of those are relevant to different companies. What I find is if I'm talking to an institutional investor, for example, in the US, who maybe conflates all of this topic with ESG, for example, which I'm sure we'll come to at some point as an unhelpful umbrella term, sometimes used, I would very specifically go down that third route of actually just showing them real business examples where by using a circular business model, you can outperform from a kind of supply chain product perspective. So part of this, I think, also is about framing, depending on which audience you're talking to, and avoiding the use of unhelpful language sometimes in order to make the case for why this really makes sense for businesses.
Thank you, Jamie. That's an excellent segue. Joanna, can I turn to you now? What's your headline view on the question?
So you asked us, is it a cost center or is it a competitive advantage? I think that question is irrelevant. I think what matters is that we're building better businesses, and that isn't just limited to profit, but that's still really important. My belief is that today we need to be defining better based on a broader range of stakeholders than just shareholders or investors. Let's acknowledge that we live in an ecosystem, and I think if we didn't learn that from the last 5 years, I don't know what we did. But better needs to be viewed through the lens of the people that work in our business, the people we serve as our customers, the partners and suppliers that we work with, frankly, the planet that provides the resources, and our shareholders. And what I think is most important is that we don't assume that better for one is worse for another. Better businesses are powerful because they find the and. They create something that is better for profit and better for planet, or better for consumers and better for profit. I'm a commercial beast and I make no apology for that. I want to lead businesses that grow their profits, because businesses that don't aren't often thriving. And I believe that if you're able to do that, you're able to be better than for just shareholders.
Super, thank you. And finally, Amy, turning to you.
It probably won't come as a surprise to you, Tom. I'm going to riff a little bit off what Joanna has just said as well, and maybe very gently challenge some of what Jamie's talking about in terms of unit economics. I'm not even sure we should be talking about sustainability anymore. I think we should be talking about security. You know, if we think about evolution and the necessity of evolution, I've been in sustainability for 30 years. And I have seen it grown from environmental risk, human rights, to corporate social responsibility, to corporate responsibility, to corporate citizenship, to sustainability. And in finance, from ethical investing to ESG, to responsible investing, to sustainable investing, to impact investing, is a constant cycle of evolution. And it very much kind of, I think, you know, it mirrors the constant cycle of evolution that we have in our natural environments. And anybody who has read Nicholas Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragile book knows that fragile systems break, fragile concepts break under stress. Robust concepts resist stress, but they only ever remain unchanged. Anti-fragile systems allow the challenge, and they get stronger from the challenge, and they evolve a bit like muscles when you exercise them. And I think, you know, this pushback that we're getting is really good, because it's demonstrating that we've been noticed. So for so much of the 30 years that I've been working in sustainability, so much of that evolution that's happened has happened outside of the, shall we say, the gaze of the predators, the populists, the politicians, etc. You know, it's been sort of under the radar in a sandbox, and we're now out of that sandbox because it is becoming more mainstream. And that's a really, really good thing. But people are naturally very uncomfortable with change, and they don't like change. As I said, you know, we're hardwired for kind of the status quo and an easy life in many ways. Sustainability, though, has never been static. It's never been static. And I think, you know, rather than talking about, you know, very much like, you know, the reflection that Joanna just gave, you know, is it a cost center, or, you know, is it a competitive advantage? Does it matter if we're talking about it through the lens of our own security? How much should our own security cost? What is the competitive advantage of our security? Are those really the right questions? So, as I said, I sort of think of this, you know, slightly differently, maybe. There's a real tension that we have to hold at the moment as a movement. You know, evolution is not a luxury, it's very much a lifeline, and sustainability can never be a fixed destination. It's got to be this kind of this living, breathing process of reimagining what it means to thrive, not just for us, but for everyone and for everything, which means we've really got to lean, I think, into the discomfort of change. And we really need to fear inertia as well. So I suppose my reflection on the question is, I think it's a moot question, because I think surely the question has to be, should we be talking about sustainability, or should we be talking about security? And it comes back to something that Chris said earlier, which is the protection of value and the protection of life. Is there any price on that we wouldn't be willing to pay?
Amy, that's brilliant. And I'm so grateful that a couple of you have challenged the question itself, because I think that that signals we're going to have a really good discussion. I think maybe we could start by sort of picking up this question of framing and how we talk about it, because I think you know, there's now kind of wide acceptance that the climate movement, the sustainability movement, has had a real issue with how we talk about it. And when you all put it like that, whether it's, you know, we're talking about kind of existential survival level stuff, or the more, or perhaps the more you know, fundamental resource scarcity, supply scarcity that Chris and Jamie started talking about, it just seems so obvious. It seems so obvious. So what's the bridge, do you think, between the language that businesses are talking and have been talking, and getting them to, you know, getting them to accept just the obvious points? This is about security. This is about resilience. Ultimately, this is about survival.
Who's that question? I was going to say, who's that question to, Tom?
Should I just have a quick? I mean, I think this is a. I would say this. This is a human problem. And it's a problem of communication, because in our world we have to look at the motivation for people to engage in this sort of thing. And whilst there are some existential threats, or it's kind of global issues and survival and things like that, it's the relevance, it's the agency that I've got to affect change, it's all those different things. So if we're talking to a CEO, a CFO, a COO, they've all got different motivations to engage, and the CMO's got different. So if we're talking in a business context, then we have to focus in on the motivation to engage with this issue. And I think that's what's often missed. We use a kind of rather lumpy approach to say it's sustainability, you know, it's all relevant to all of you, and you know, we've got to do this, otherwise we're all going to burn or whatever. So I think, you know, it's going to come back to communication. It's about how do we align everyone behind a single thought, single vision that is relevant to the business, relevant to employees, relevant to consumers, relevant to the wider society. That's what we need to line up if we're going to get the momentum behind the change that we need, because this is going to be uncomfortable. Change is uncomfortable, but we should embrace it, because I totally agree in what you're saying, that change is exciting. We become more resilient, stronger through the change, but you've got to bring people along that journey. And I think that is about, you know, storytelling through motivation. So it's I think it's a human problem, this.
I completely agree with you, Chris. I think we've lost the art of storytelling. It's an ancient art, and we've reduced everything to data. Everything has become transactional and not relationship based. And as a result, we've kind of lost that ability to really connect with each other, and to connect with the bigger story. And, you know, if I go back to that sort of what I was saying earlier, sort of, you know, 30 years in sustainability, it is a story. The whole point of sustainability and the sustainability movement, it has been telling a story. And I have lost track of how many times, you know, during that 30 years, I've had to shout plot twist, because either a character's died and a new character's turned up, or a narrative has died and a new narrative has emerged. You know, we have to be willing to let things die to allow new things, you know, to emerge. And to get people comfortable with that, it is the art of storytelling. It's making people feel that you are there on the adventure with them. I mean, how many times when we were kids, you know, when somebody says once upon a time, and you sort of settle down with your cup of tea and go, oh, goody, I'm here for this. I want this story. We have to do that. That's quite difficult in finance, where, as Jamie will know, the underlying source code in finance is pretty much data, and it's all geared towards, you know, risk mitigation, risk management, and that awful word that should be retired tomorrow if I had a magic wand, which is alpha. Because alpha is violent language. It comes from alpha wolf, alpha male. It's dominance. You know, it's the wrong language, you know, for a system that should be a compassionate, empathetic, caring, just system that delivers resilience for everybody, not alpha. That's my little soapbox moment. Sorry, Tom, I had to get that off my chest. So I do think, Chris, sorry, yeah, Chris, you're right on storytelling. Yeah,
you were saying, Amy, that so I went from setting up the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to setting up and raising several funds to invest in the circular economy. And for me, the learning curve in working out how to talk to, for example, a US pension fund about these topics, I won't put a specific name on it, is just a completely different way that I had to work out and find out how to engage them and use stories about companies and how companies benefit from this. And a lot of the language and the framing that I was used, kind of softer language that I used at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation just didn't work. It didn't cut through. So I do think it is quite context specific and target audience specific.
Completely agree, Jamie. I think the stories are always have to be adapted for the audience. You know, that's a given. My real challenge though is in this preoccupation with data. So much of the new system that is emerging is on the periphery of the existing system, and as a result, it's quite messy. It's operating in areas that we don't yet know necessarily how to measure. There are some areas that we know we can measure. There are other areas that we know we need to measure, but we don't quite understand how to measure at the moment. And then there are areas that, frankly, do they really need to be measured? And I always use the analogy of, Tom, I'll use you as the guinea pig here. You're married, aren't you? I know you're married. And I know you're married very happily. How much do you love your wife? Give me a number.
I'm not going to give you a number because I'll embarrass myself.
But also, you can't give me a number. And I would sincerely hope, Tom, that you didn't spreadsheet your wife before you popped the question. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't value in that relationship and value in that activity and that action that you undertook. And a lot of the new system that is emerging is kind of, I know it's a bit of a flippant example, but it's kind of in that space where we're having to get really comfortable with messiness and the relationship, the messy relationship between risk and reward, and no causation but correlation and relationships. So I completely agree with you, Jamie. It's all kind of context specific, but we also do have to gently challenge people we're speaking to as to their two things. I think their relationship with profit and their relationship with data, and help them understand potentially, a lot of, and I think Chris, this comes back to what you said, a lot of the challenge that we have out there is up here. It's not in the money, it's not in the technology, it's up here.
And I think, Amy, that connects to what I've said is a really unhelpful, I think, framing, which is you can either have profit or you can have positive impact. And that's such an unhelpful sort of mental model that people have in their head, because I actually think there are so many opportunities where you can create positive impact and improve profitability. I'm sort of riffing a little bit off of one of the comments in the chat around my line managers asking for ROI. Jackie, apologies, I hope you don't mind me kind of picking on your question. I think we should be challenging on what impact is this creating, but I think our view of impact should be broader. And yes, maybe that's a story, but maybe it needs to be backed up by some information. I think there needs to be clarity as we create more resilient businesses. But I think it is that point around impact should be beyond the sort of one narrow definition of it.
Just to pick up on I think Amy and Jamie both mentioned the system. The system is fundamentally broken, and short-termism is driving decisions which are not good for the business in the long term. That's as simple as that. But that's the way the system works. It's the reporting systems, it's the reward systems. Populism is again another barrier to progress, because it's based on BS. There's absolutely no support for a lot of the claims, a lot of the trajectory. So that is a kind of another thing. The people who tell the best story win. Populism's telling the best story. It's absolute nonsense, but it's telling the best story. So that we've got to live up to that. We've got to challenge that. And I think we've just done some research with consumers, employees, and businesses about language, about semiotics of language around sustainability and all those sort of things. And the key thing, which won't be kind of new news, but too many businesses are trying to explain their sustainability strategy, and it's just really complex. No one understands it, or they're selling a vision that's so lofty that they're going, well, it's not relevant to me. Good luck, crack on. So if we want to get each of these stakeholder groups behind what we're doing, which is creating a better world, then we need to look at the way that we are telling that story. So it is one story, and I think, Jamie, you said adapt the story to make sure that you're speaking to their needs, their objectives, and its personal objectives, as well as business objectives. So I think we're doing a really bad job at telling the brilliant story. That's fundamental. That's where we create value. That's how I think we create value, because you create momentum, you amplify, you accelerate. That's what, and we can demonstrate it through data if necessary, but that's a support function to the story we're telling, not the story. The data isn't the story.
I think that's a really interesting perspective. It's one story adapted to the audience, and we're really bad at telling it because we are schooled in the system that we have, and we are schooled, and business leadership follows a playbook that fulfills that narrative. And Jamie, I hope don't mind me saying, but you really shifted my understanding of this whole topic when you said, let's not use words like sustainability, let's not use green or eco or anything like those. Those should just be consigned to the bin, and we should just talk about, how our business is going to survive on a finite planet when the resources they rely on start to dry up. So there's a thread there. I mean, I'm sort of keen to, if it were possible, I'd probably, we'd all win prizes, but what is the golden thread of that story that we just need to adapt? And is there something around, it's actually the type of leadership that we're missing? Is our leadership too playbooky? Is it, what needs to change in the way we're leading businesses through this?
That's how they're rewarded, how leaders are rewarded, I think, unless you run your own business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the,
go for it, Jamie.
No, I was just going to say on the framing bit, and Amy, you mentioned about all of these topics and ideas getting kind of reinvented every so often. I remember, just as a little anecdote, I remember in a 2010, we had this idea, which was if we could write a report to illustrate how much value the circular economy could create from a commercial perspective, that would move the needle more than anything else at the time. And we thought, right, we'll get a mainstream business actor to kind of publish the report. So we did it with McKinsey. And I remember going through the report with Ellen, doing a kind of control F on any of those words that you mentioned, like climate, sustainability, all those things. And that was based on this fantastic guy we had at the foundation at the time called Ken Webster, who was a kind of systems thinker. And he encouraged me to read a book by George Lakoff called Don't Think of an Elephant. And in that book, effectively, it talks about the need to reframe into a new language, effectively, in order to sidestep existing traps within that language. And you can see that loads of the stuff we're talking about at the moment is kind of, it's even probably triggering people on this call because they have a particular perception of what someone means when they use a certain term. So in fact, one of the things that we can do is step back, invent some slightly new language, or find different stories where we can get the same points across, but in a much more effective way, I think.
Completely agree with you, Jamie. And I was going to say, we're seeing that with the DEI backlash at the moment. The smart players out there are pivoting to the language of talent and opportunity because that resonates with everybody. There's a kind of a more of a universal understanding as to what talent and opportunity is, whereas the DEI kind of moniker has become a really triggering moniker for so many people. And I think it is, etymology and lexicology are going to be our friends as we move forward in terms of trying to find, the right words. And I think, Chris, to something that you said earlier, I'm not sure the system is broken. The system's serving the purpose for which it was built, and it's doing it really well. We just have to challenge the purpose. And the purpose surely can't be about sustainability. The purpose has got to be about security. And I think, Jamie, talking to what you've just been referring to, and Tom, what you mentioned as well, around this is about, without using words like survival, because that is also a very triggering word for some people, but this is about a future where we can thrive. Everybody can thrive. Businesses can thrive, governments can thrive, all of the living species on this planet can thrive, and that is about security. And I just wonder, whether we are just sort of so wedded to the language that we have created over the last couple of years that we are unwilling to let it go, because it's almost like our little baby. We've gave birth to this language, and therefore there's this sort of this grief of having to let it go. Some things we really are going to have to let go. And to Alison, is there a DEI backlash in the UK? There isn't a backlash to the extent that there is in the US, but a lot of UK companies have US footprints and US supply chains, so they're having to respond because of the pressures that they're getting, because of the footprint that they have in their value chain to the US. So, you know, we also have to be mindful that the relationships that we have throughout our value chain do then expose us to different types of pressures as well in different jurisdictions. But I do wonder whether we need to reframe everything. And Chris, I think you sort of alluded to this. I think the industry, think of the impact economy as an industry, has been a little too liberally elite. And as a result, the narrative that has been coming out has to quite, I think, significant parts of the community felt as if it's morally indignant and that we have placed ourselves somehow on the moral high ground and we are looking down at them. And nobody likes to feel like somebody is looking down at them. And especially if you're struggling to put food on the table because you're a single mum on benefits and you've got 3 kids and somebody's whacking you over the head going, you need to be buying organic and you should have an electric car. You know, we need to be much more, and this, Jamie, this comes back to something you were saying. It is the context. It's learning to enable our language to be far more context specific and empathetic in what it is that we're, you know, that we are trying to get a very broad range of stakeholders to back.
Nobody likes being told off, and also nobody likes really to be told that everything's awful. And I think that's another area the climate movement has really sort of, and I won't say gone wrong, because, you know, it's obviously important that the world understands the challenges it's facing. But do we need to pivot now into much more of a story of opportunity, of possibility, because that's what people will aspire to and hook onto? And is that the sort of golden thread? Is that our one story that we then adapt as necessary? But how do we do that, and where do we start, and how do we speak, Amy, to your point, to those different audiences?
I think you've got to start by being curious about where someone's coming from, right? I think often actually the risk is that you decide what your narrative is and you tell it regardless of whether you've actually tried to put yourself into somebody else's shoes. And I think the danger of kind of language is that it ends up being inaccessible. I think, Amy, to your point of, you know, we kind of created a moral high ground that means that people don't feel like they can participate. I think populism is doing a brilliant job of creating a very simple narrative and creating a rallying cry around it. And frankly, our job is to do our version of that, but better. People will only be able to participate if they feel like they understand, and they'll only be able to understand if you've been curious enough to stand in their shoes and wonder what their perspective might be.
I think
Amen, Joanna.
Just to add to that, I think one of the challenges with populism creates very simple solutions for very complex problems. What we're doing is we have got a massive issue and we are communicating complex solutions to a complex problem. And I think that there is some simplicity, and even at an employee level. And I think, just to indulge me just for 1 minute, just to tell you a story. So 50% of all insurance is done in America. 90% plus of all insurance is done in the Northern Hemisphere. So the people who are most affected on the climate front line cannot get insurance against climate disasters, climate impacts. And also they don't trust it. That system doesn't work down there. So they can't afford it, can't trust it. So an organization came to us and said, called Climate Action Trust, really dull name, said, you know, we need to cut through with a story that's going to communicate what we're doing. And what insurance does for farmers in the developing world is that it allows them to take risk. So at the moment, they just keep all the profits from harvest because they know a disaster is going to happen. And if a disaster happens, they get wiped out, and therefore they have to save their money and all the rest of it. So they never take risks. They never put in irrigation. The children don't get to school because they need to save that money. Their health is affected because they can't afford that. Everything in their life is affected by the lack of insurance. So we created this narrative with this organization who needed to raise a lot of money, but had to tell a very complex story because their solution is something called parametric insurance. I mean, no one understood it apart from the insurance industry. They're going to big foundations and funds to try and get a solution to this. but they had to tell a better story. So that was the story they told, renamed them Humanity Insured. And that's fundamentally what they're doing. They are underwriting insurance in the global south to allow people to take risks in life that we all take for granted. That story is now resonating with funders across the globe. They are raising tens of millions of pounds to subsidize insurance in the global south. That's a very complex problem, but a really powerful, simple story that everyone goes, wow, that's really powerful. So I really encourage you to have a look at Humanity Insured as a concept, a new idea of taking quite a complex instrument of insurance and solving these human problems. And it is resonating with funders who wouldn't know the first thing about insurance and parametric insurance, things like that. So those are the sort of things we're maybe telling complex solutions to complex problems, but actually we need to solve that in a more tell human stories to these big problems.
No, and Chris, I think it's really right, because I think if we just focus on sort of what Joanna was saying, the let's call it, the resistance, to sort of the backlash, the opposition to what it is that we're all trying to kind of move us towards. So a lot of that stems from, as I said earlier, this discomfort with change, and the very human reaction to then like literally grab on to the status quo, even if the status quo is self-sabotaging. It's familiar, and I like familiarity, despite the fact it breeds contempt. Anyway, but I like familiarity. The backlash, the orchestrators of the backlash are, as Joanna have said, are very, very good storytellers. Even if their stories are anchored in mistruths, and lies in a lot of instances, where they're very good at storytelling, they also have been much better organized than we have been. I think in the rush for us all to want to prove ourselves, to prove that we have best new product, we've probably forgotten how to actually collaborate better with each other, to elevate each other up. And we will not win this current sort of battle, if that's the right word. I don't want to get too kind of military on this, but we won't win the current battle because we're right. We're going to win it because we're better organized and we have a better story. And I think that story, coming to something that Jamie, was talking about earlier, that story has to appeal to both the heart, and that's the emotional side of things, as well as the head. And when you're in business and you're trying to push through change, you have to be able to address head and heart. So you do need data. You do need to be able to say, this is the bottom line. These are the unit economics. This is the competitive advantage of doing X, Y, and Z. And by the way, it's also going to make you feel really good about what you do at this company. As well. So we've got to be a lot smarter about, the stories, as all of us here are, I think, are change makers. Our business is to invest in and orchestrate and deliver change. So we have to be able to at all times speak to head and heart, and as well as recognize context. So we have to be, in many ways, actors. A lot of this is theatre. It's presenting the story that somebody wants to hear, so that they feel that you've co-opted yourself into their shoes, into their world, into their life, and you can help them reach their potential. A lot of it is kind of, the theatre of it all. And again, I think that is learning for the movement at large. How do we do this? Because fundamentally what we're talking about here is behavior change, and we have to sort of be Pied Pipers.
That seems like a brilliant time to bring in one of the questions from our audience. So Jackie has asked whether one of the challenges or one of the problems is that we're talking about this amongst the sustainability community, but we're not bringing this question of the narrative and the framing more broadly to the business world. Do you think that's where we're sort of partly where we're going wrong? Is that we're being guilty of sticking in the echo chamber and having this debate amongst ourselves, but not really opening it up to the people who are going to be dealing with it?
I'm going to go in with a point of view. So I think I subscribe to that. I think there is a risk that we talk to the people who agree with us and we don't talk to the people who disagree with us, and therefore we don't ever understand how those who disagree with us pick holes in our story. If I think about one of the most enlightening and frustrating conversations I've had in the last kind of couple of years on this topic. It was with a Tory MP when we were doing the mass lobby of Parliament for the Better Business Act. And I sat speaking to an MP who just fundamentally disagreed with the whole premise of what we were trying to do. But only by having that conversation did we make the narrative stronger. So if you don't engage with those people who don't believe, then I don't think you have the opportunity actually to make that, to understand their provocations. And I don't think you should only listen just to kind of make your story stronger. You should listen because their perspective is a different one from yours. And actually we would, there's a risk that we end up kind of becoming polar opposites. It's them or us. That's not helpful, right? This world needs people to come together more. And that is going to require us sitting around a table with the people who fundamentally disagree with what we believe.
I think, Joanna, we've got to become amateur psychologists. In the industry that I work in, we often refer to as what we do as wealth whispering, a little bit like horse whispering, partly because you're really helping people understand what their core belief system is. Why do you believe the things that you believe? And how many of the things that you believe might you think are actually self-sabotaging? Because our belief systems are pretty much set by the time we're 7 or 8 years old. And then we use life circumstances to reinforce those beliefs. See, I told you I was right. I mean, how many times can we point to a period in our life where we've all done that and kind of gone, see, I told you I was right. I'm an unlucky person, or I'm not attractive, or things like that don't happen to me. We all have these belief systems that can often prevent us from making the decisions that actually free us up and release us to, really inhabit the potential that we have. And I think as sustainability practitioners, the most important skill that you can have now is to listen, to really listen and to observe. Because 30% of what somebody's telling you is in the words that they use. The rest is in all forms of, body language, other sort of actions. And when you really listen and when you really observe, it's quite interesting how you start to see how something might be driving the behavior. And that's the entry point, is to sort of say, I can see, it's really interesting that you've said that, because, I feel the same. I'm as scared as you are, but I've learned how to walk through this, or I've, experienced something like that as well. And I learned how to deal with it. It is about, finding those doors to really connect with somebody and then kind of walking with them. And we, again, I don't think I completely agree with you, Joanna, because I just don't think we do enough of it. I think we're very good at soapboxing and getting our little soapbox ready, standing up in it and going, la, 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 this is what we believe. This is why you need to do it. So you're going to do it, aren't you? And then people go, no. And we're like, oh, okay, why not? Because we haven't listened and we haven't observed and we haven't walked in their shoes. And I think, psychology and that ability to be amateur psychologist is going to be really critical as we move forward, whether we're talking to somebody in the community, somebody in the business, somebody in government, somebody elsewhere.
I'm interested in Jamie's view on how he tells his circular story, because that is a complex story. It's the most obvious thing. It's literally the most simple, obvious thing that we should be absolutely doing it. But it's incredibly complex for a business to embrace that, an investor to embrace that, and then the consumer to even get their head around, okay, what is that? So I'm interested in how you're succeeding in that space.
Yeah. Well, maybe a couple of thoughts on that. So I think the easiest way to talk about the circular economy is to first talk about the linear economy and its limitations, and that then allows you to talk about that. The easiest way to talk to an investor about the circular economy, frankly, is not to talk to them about it from the environmental benefits or the social benefits initially. I go in hard with the commercial benefits, and at some point they say to me, but doesn't it have all sorts of other benefits as well? And I go, oh, it's funny that you say that. Actually, yes, it does. And that's when you've got them effectively. And then I think through stories of companies is the way that you tell the story in terms of why it is beneficial. So if I give you one example If I'm, you know, back home at Christmas time and I'm talking to some very cynical person about what I do, and they say, this whole thing that you do in the circular economy, how does that make sense? How do you do that? And I maybe use an example like Bike Club in the UK. So 70,000 subscribers of Children's Bicycle. Your child grows out of their bike every 18 months. So rather than buying the bike, you rent the bike. When you finish with it, you press a button on your phone, the old bike gets taken away, a new one arrives. And effectively, it's really good for you as a user, because you get a better bike, you get an aluminium bike rather than a steel one, which is nicer for your child to ride. You can share some of the improved unit economics because you can keep the bike operating over many, many more families over many years, because it's a high quality bike that you're refurbishing between each use. And you don't have the hassle factor of working out what you're going to do with this bike, in particular if you live in a city and you need to store it somewhere. So it's kind of like, it makes sense on many levels, and they go, okay, I kind of get you then. And then you can go into the one, this stat for me is the one that really stuck in my mind. If you look at the amount of materials that we will use globally between now and 2050, so the amount of copper, steel, alloy, concrete, etc., it's the equivalent of a city the size of New York every month between now and 2050, we will bring on stream in terms of the amount of materials. Then think about the amount of energy, logistics, etc. So that kind of linear take, make, dispose model of production consumption just ain't going to cut it. So you've got to move to a more regenerative model effectively. So there's various ways, but I would kind of use those tools in different ways.
I mean, I've always been struck, Jamie, by how simple you make that message. And it is, as Chris says, you know, the more you dig into it, the more complex it is. But I think, you know, I suppose to reiterate the point we've all been making, or you've all been making, is it's all down to the framing and the simplicity of it. Maybe part of the problem is the whole sphere of social and environmental impact is so broad that if we're trying to capture the whole lot in a simple message, it's simply impossible. But if you pick a swim lane like circularity or like plastic, I think the plastic movement is extremely good at telling a very straightforward narrative. Maybe that's what we should be better at doing, is picking a swim lane and sticking to it. Just a couple more questions that I'd love to sort of bring in. So Sarah asks, how can we show empathy to the many businesses who are really struggling today while they are aware of and need to change? Calling out particularly the mental health concerns of SME business leaders. They face pressure. Isn't even just sort of the way we talk about it a nice to have. What would you say to those business leaders, Chris?
I think the way the businesses are operating is changing, and thinking in a sustainable way or a regenerative way. I know I would say this anyway, it is one of the most exciting opportunities there is out there. So the SMEs are really struggling. They're under the cosh with all sorts of different pressures. But I would take a slightly longer term perspective of it. They're worrying about paying their people tomorrow, let alone 2-3 years time. But there is a longer term strategy that if you set out that longer term vision, you'll start changing direction and you'll start changing your fortunes. And I think that's the kind of perspective that if you can see this as a really exciting opportunity, a business commercial opportunity, and saying, right, how do I adapt my business to reflect this opportunity, rather than thinking it's another thing that people are going to hit me over the head with, or it's another task or another that. I think this is it's a mindset, which is, again, I understand it's easy to say when you're trying to pay the bills tomorrow, but I think that there is a psychology where if you look at things as opportunity for a longer term rather than the short term.
Mm-hmm. And Joanna, I guess as a business leader, where do you draw your energy from to double down on this issue when things, as they inevitably do in every business, become more challenging?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would focus on is, I think, and Amy's talked brilliantly about this, is the resilience that it gives you within your business. Actually, if you're an SME business facing challenges, actually some of how you create more resilience is by looking at your supply chain and where do you have risk in your talent. This is as much about making sure that you are creating more resilience in your business. And then again, I go back to a commercial beast. I want a business to be thriving in all aspects of it. And I think, as Chris said, actually, improving your business, making your business better represents one of the biggest opportunities. But I think you have to broaden your sense of who are the stakeholders that are most important.
Yeah, super. And final question, and then be warned, I'm going to ask you to wrap up shortly. But I'm very aware, this isn't billed as a B Corp discussion, but we are all involved or close to the B Corp community. What do you think the role of B Corp is in answering this question? How can it really help? How can it really help us? How can we work with them? How can it help us move the dial on some of these issues?
Shall I take that, seeing as I sit on the board in the UK as well? I think everyone's looking at me going, you can answer that one. So the B Corp movement is an extraordinary success story in terms of what it has given birth to. And I think it's just right, actually, just on today's call, we just take a moment to give huge and deep gratitude and thanks to Andrew Kassoy, one of the co-founders of the B Corp movement, who passed away on Sunday from a very courageous battle with cancer. He has left such an extraordinary legacy. I can't even begin to imagine how proud his family must be of what he has left behind, as well as being heartbroken that he's no longer with us, as I think a lot of people in the movement are. You think about those early days of, three guys coming together to say, there's got to be a better way. Of course, there's got to be a better way. What can that better way look like? Or what are one of the ways in which, we can define, as Joanna was saying earlier, we can define what better looks like. What does better look like? And I think the B Corp movement is a wonderful articulation of one way in which better can exist within what is quite a predatory system at the moment. And B Corps can exist and they can thrive. But I think we're also very aware of the fact that we ourselves still are on a journey. We still have a long way to go. And, there is a certain amount of room and runway that we have in terms of defining the ceiling, but at the same time we need the floor to raise up as well. And again, to what Joanna was talking about, the Better Business Act and Better Business Act equivalences, in other jurisdictions around the world. What can we learn from the B Lab movement? I think it is, my observations on it, it is very collaborative, it is very collegiate, and it feels, and I normally hate this expression, so I'm going to shoot myself later for saying it, but it does feel a little bit like a family. There's a huge amount of embedded support within that network because everybody has signed up to live and breathe and play with their businesses, in a similar way. So there's this kind of solidarity and camaraderie that exists that I don't think exists elsewhere in other business sectors. And I think we can learn a lot about the relationships, therefore, that have been built within that B Corp movement and the relationships that B Corps then build with their clients, their employees, their customers, because that's what we do. We're, despite what some people may feel, it's not a cult. We're just a bunch of incredibly impassioned, mission-driven businesses who genuinely believe that there are pathways to define what better looks like and to deliver what better is in the marketplace. And we're, the community is very open. It's not about flipping everybody to become, a B Corp. The new standards that have just dropped are obviously a stepping up of the framework within which we all, are accountable, and that's a good thing. That has been long anticipated and long awaited. That is a good thing. But this is about demonstrating what is possible when you think outside of that kind of very narrow little box that we have. It is not the only model out there. It is one of the most popular models, I think, out there at the moment, but it is not the only model. It is the spirit of being B, of being a B. I think that is so important. You don't have to be a B to behave and think and operate like a B. And I think that's what we can kind of learn. And that's hopefully the currency, that currency of solidarity, compassion, empathy, adventure. Those are the currencies, hope, that we can take more broadly out into the marketplace and hopefully just inspire people to want to live and breathe those on a daily basis. And I think, and again, I mean, Joanna, you've been so heavily involved in the Better Business Act as well. we need to take those principles. Oh my goodness, we need to take those principles into Parliament.
Yeah. Any very, very quick final thoughts on that B Corp question from anyone? Because I'm aware that everyone will have a view on that, but also that we need to wrap up. Amy, that brilliantly articulated. And I do, if you haven't watched the very, very moving tribute to Andrew Cassoy, I really urge you to do so, because it speaks to some of the issues we've been talking about today.
And get a tissue when you watch it as well, Tom. That's the other piece of advice. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, if anyone does have further thoughts on B Corp, then maybe hold them until you sort of close out. So what I'd like to do is invite each of you to sort of give me your rapid fire conclusion. And initially, I was going to ask the question: why keep or kill sustainability in your business strategy? I suspect that is the wrong question, given that we've gone much more fundamental than that. So maybe instead, what's the one thing that you would like to see every CEO up and down the land across the world do tomorrow that would make a difference? Jamie, I'm going to start with you.
I think see the opportunity that it represents in its fullest form. And I think that there are a growing number of leaders of businesses who do see that, from family-run businesses to others that have other types of shareholders. But I think that's what I would like to see. People realize the full opportunity that it represents for their business, their employees, and the broader community.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joanna.
My final thoughts are be curious enough to stand in the person's shoes that doesn't agree with you, and don't use the concept that profit comes at the expense of creating a better business.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I agree with Jamie saying, I think we need to look at this as a business opportunity, but understand that it's a human challenge. And to create value, we need to understand the motivations of each of those stakeholder groups. We've talked about telling a better story, and we believe that you tell a better story, but you've got to give people a role in that story, a role that is commensurate with their ability, their capacity, their ambitions and their desires, not just forcing them or talking to them in a broadcast way. Involve them in the story, give them a role in your story.
Brilliant. I like that. Amy.
Well, there's so many questions I'd love to pose them. I think the big one would be knowing everything that we now know about the environmental crisis, the cultural crisis, the political crises, the social crises, and the economic crises. Are you happy? And if you're not happy, why aren't you happy? And do something about it. And that's a personal question to them to really reflect on where they are currently in these poly and perma crises.
That is a very, very powerful ending question. And I feel like I'm going to pose it to everyone I meet. We should all pose it to everyone we meet and see what happens thereafter. So thank you all so much. Thank you firstly for basically moderating yourself. You've made my life extremely easy, but you're all wonderful, wonderful visionary people, and I've hugely appreciated our conversation today. Thank you everyone who's joined us. Really appreciate you joining from wherever you are in the world, because I know we've got people from all over the place. Please do keep the conversation going after this session within your businesses, on social media, any other forum to which you have access or a voice, and especially as Joanna invites us to, the people who don't agree with us. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day and see you very soon.